and welcome to this latest edition of Talk About London, a podcast about how to make the capital city a better place. I'm Leanne Tritton, Chair of the London Society, one of the UK's oldest charitable civic societies.
Dave Hill, and I'm the publisher and editor of the journalism website onlondon.co.uk.
Day in, day out, we hear more bad news about London's housing emergency. Too many homes in London are unaffordable, insecure and in poor condition, and the city is struggling to build more of them.
Now, a lot of this is far from new. The capital has always had bad landlords and poorly built accommodation, and it has always been more expensive than other places. But in recent years, the situation has grown steadily worse.
And today, it is pretty much impossible to be a first-time buyer without the help of the bank of mum and dad. Waiting lists for social rented homes are huge, and one London child in 21 is homeless, which is a shocking statistic. What needs to be done to rescue the capital from a housing situation that threatens its future as a good and successful city?
Now, our guest for this edition of Talk About London is Rowan Moore, architecture critic of The Observer and the author of several books, including Slow Burn City, which is specifically about London in the 21st century, and most recently Property, the myth that built the world. Rowan, welcome to our show.
Hello, very pleased to be here.
Okay, so I should start off by telling our audience that your new book, Property, is not, which I'm going to hold up helpfully, there it is, handsome looking volume. It's not about London, although it's very much got an international focus, but there are various mentions of London through it, and illuminating mentions, and much of your analysis seems to be very, very relevant to the capital at the moment, and your proposed solutions. So what I'd like to do right from the beginning is just sort of step back and ask you a very broad opening question, is how on earth did London get itself into the terrible mess it's in at the moment?
Well, as you say, my book is not just about London, but London is kind of exhibit A of a sort of particularly intense example and incubator of what is a global phenomenon of sort of major city centres becoming unaffordable. I think what we are seeing now is the outcome of this sort of 40, 50-year experiment with what Margaret Thatcher called the property owning democracy, which is the idea that you sort of you leave housing to the market, but it's a funny kind of market because it's one where the supply is always going to be restricted, and it's also one in which inflation, which is regarded as a terrible thing in every other commodity, and that Margaret Thatcher was very proud of defeating inflation in every other commodity, was until recently hailed as a great thing. So you had headlines saying, isn't it fantastic, property prices have gone up 10%, 15% in the last year. And of course that's fantastic for the people who already own, moderately fantastic because not much you can actually do with that sort of paper wealth, but it's not good news at all for the people who don't own. And we've kind of reached the point where it's just working less and less well, and this has been a very long time coming. I mean, I wrote articles in the Evening Standard literally 25 years ago saying this is a problem. And we have to find our way out of it. And the kind of solutions I talk about, and there's no one magic bullet, have to be ones in which the state takes a more active role, with all the problems that can entail. But we've given the market a sort of a free-ish hand, and it's not really delivering. So I think good models to look at are places as different as Vienna or Singapore, where public authorities don't just provide housing of last resort, they don't just provide housing for the most needy people, but a whole range of incomes. So the state becomes a major supplier of housing, which is then affordable for people who need it. That's a very long way from where we are now, because the current government is still going down the route of saying, let's sort of free up the planning system and then 1.5 million new homes will magically appear. And I think we can see very clearly that that's not happening and it's not going to happen. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that this is the housing crisis is a crisis of affordability. It's not a crisis in so much of sheer numbers of housing. And obviously laws of supply and demand say the two things are linked, but it's the nature of the housing market is it's an imperfect connection. So we are unlikely through building lots of new houses to make a significant impact on price. So therefore you have to look at public housing, as I said. And also, this is slightly outside my comfort zone, but look at tax and financial incentives or disincentives that push the prices of property up. So you can stop doing what previous governments have done, which is if house prices show any sign of falling, to kind of zhuzh up the market through things like Help to Buy, through stamp duty cuts, even if it'd be a good thing if stamp duty was reformed. Just cutting stamp duty is not going to improve affordability, because what all these things do is they make owners of property richer rather than homes more accessible to people who can't afford them. So that's a broad range of instruments. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it absolutely does. I'd like to, you mentioned Singapore, and I'd just like to read a couple of sentences from your book where you say, "It is not outrageous socialism nor fantastical idealism to propose public intervention in such a crucial public good as the provision of homes. In Singapore, a state often praised by neoliberal commentators for its rip-roaring private enterprise, 80% of the population live in state-provided housing, which is sort of an extraordinary thing, isn't it, when you think about it? And it's a wonderful example, for you to sort of back up your point. But I was very struck, again, a term that you use in your book, where you talk about the need for policymakers to make a kind of, and perhaps the public too, to make a mental adjustment from seeing property as a private asset to seeing it as a kind of social one whose equitable management everybody has a collective interest in. Can you just, you've sort of, some of your examples, your ideas for how to make things better, sort of talk to that theme. Can you speak a bit more broadly about that and what needs to be done and where the leadership for that would come from?
Well, what we have to get away from is this sort of obsession with homes as an investment. People essentially seeing their homes as their kind of pension fund, away from the incentives. At the moment, the way tax is done on property or not done, it kind of incentivizes the hoarding of domestic space. Yeah, the more domestic space you own, the better from a kind of financial investment point of view, because you can potentially earn or make profits on that are unearned and untaxed. We need to get away from that idea, and I think we need to see housing as a social good. There's a way that health and transport are social goods. That really it should be not really negotiable that anyone can have access to a basic minimum of housing. That requires leadership from on top. And I'm not very optimistic we're going to see it in the near future. By the way, I'd also, people talk about building a lot. It's always about building new homes, and that, of course, is important. But that takes time. I think we should also be looking at how we use the homes that already exist, how the space in them is used. In the 70s, you actually had a phenomenon of local authorities buying homes on the market and converting them from private market use to public housing. I think that's happening a little bit now in Britain, but that seems like a promising way to go. that is different from the idea that you always have to get out the concrete mixers and the builders.
Yes. Well, before I bring Leanne in, I'd like to just explore a couple of these themes with you. And I will also talk about greenbelt housing in new towns, which we'll come on to in a moment. But this point about people having a lot more space than they actually need, sort of inefficient use of housing that's already available, is very interesting one, I think. And you in your book you write about an LSE study, and I think there have been others which look at if you did change the way that housing is taxed, or housing wealth or property ownership is taxed, it would create incentives. This is what you're saying, is it would create incentives for people who've got a lot more rooms than they need, perhaps when they're older and their children have moved out, to downsize, to use the term. It would create incentives for them to do that, and that would be a good thing. So there would be better use made of bedrooms and space that is already built, and because building new stuff is not that great for the climate. Is that right? Have I got the right idea there?
Yes, you have got that right. And also building new stuff we don't really have the labour and material resources to suddenly greatly increase the production of housing. The report you refer to sort of did a study. It made an argument that if you look at domestic residential space in terms of floor area, that there's kind of enough to go around.
Yeah.
And so therefore you have to find a way to use it better without a kind of Soviet-style collectivization. And so they argue for forms of taxation that basically tax what might be regarded as the sort of luxury part of domestic space. So in the same way that food, you don't pay VAT on bread and your basics, but I think you pay VAT on luxury kinds of food, or you could potentially. You could do that with housing. They don't entirely flesh out the detail of this, but it seems to me that's a principle that's important to pursue.
Okay. Can I ask you to explain, you see these debates online and all over the place, and you referred to it earlier, the idea that if we just deregulated the planning system, a multitude of new homes would flow. But you argue in your book that actually it just isn't that simple, and that the invisible hand of Adam Smith just doesn't really work properly, particularly with the London property market. Have I got that right? And can you say a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, there's two reasons for that. One is that it's kind of a fantasy to think we'll ever have a sort of totally deregulated planning system, because the planning system exists because people want it to exist, because they don't want things appearing in their backyard out of the blue that they have no say over. And almost anyone would want a system that protects historic assets, nature, the countryside to some degree. So that's one problem. The other is Oliver Letwin wrote the former Conservative minister, wrote an important report some years ago when he talked about absorption, which is the principle that house builders won't build so many homes that they start lowering the value of their own product. So if you imagine a situation in which you loosen up the planning system and house builders start building more homes, and they build in enough numbers that the price starts dropping, that's the point at which they'll stop building. And they can do that because they are in a sort of semi-monopolistic situation. I mean, there's more than one house builder, but there's a fairly small number of them. So it's not like, selling tomatoes on a market stall in a street market where, if the guy next door sells tomatoes for 10p less than yours, they're going to sell all the tomatoes and you're not. The idea that just liberalising planning is the answer is I think, for the birds. And I think the government's own figures say that I think if you increase, sorry, I don't have the figure on the top of my head, but they say if you build the number of houses to the numbers the government's talking about, that might produce something like a 5% cut in prices, all other factors being equal, which of course they're not.
They're not, yes.
And, 5% decrease would be sort of helpful a bit, but it's not the kind of radical transformation that we need.
Absolutely. Let me, before I shut up and let Leanne get a word in, can I just ask you, you write about new towns and green belts, and of course, right at the top of the recommendations of the New Towns Task Force was a site, a green belt site in Enfield, and also in Thamesmead. How optimistic are you that these London new towns are going to be delivered quickly and be as successful as we would all like them to be?
Well, yeah, I support the principle. New town at Thamesmead, great. I would support, and there might be people in Enfield who don't agree with me, but I would in principle support a new town in the green belt in Enfield. Can I just say something about sort of green belts, which is, that was a planning invention that was originally created for the benefit of the city. It was originally something that's supposed to benefit the people in the city so they could have some countryside to go to at the weekend. It's turned into something that is mainly there for the benefit of people who live in the green belt, which of course is also important, but it has become an excessively constricting force. The London green belt is 3 times the size of London itself. So you don't have to build on very much of it to find land for housing. And also, there's such a huge amount of value locked up in it, because if you get planning permission for building on greenbelt land, the value increases exponentially. So the principle on which new towns can be built and were built in the past is you capture that uplift in value and you spend that uplift on public benefits, on infrastructure, affordable housing, etc., as well as allowing for market housing. Okay, having said all that, how optimistic am I? New towns have never happened quickly. The post-war new town movement eventually created homes for, I think, 2.5 million people. But it took a really long time. It took maybe 20 years. And I think there are reasons why it will be harder now than then, because, in the late 40s and the 50s, the government felt empowered to compulsorily purchase huge swathes of land, and I think that's going to be quite a lot harder now. So I'm, cautiously welcome these new towns, but I think they will take time. And they're certainly not a quick fix. They're not going to make a significant difference on anyone's housing need before the next election.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Rowan. Leanne, please.
So much to unpick, and I think one of the themes that the London Society has been pursuing this year has been about housing of all sorts. And, it's very, very clear that all roads, there's not a single headline, I don't think, that I read that doesn't lead back to housing, whether that's education outcomes, health, employment opportunities, crime. So in my mind, I've come to the conclusion, and this is a personal opinion, that housing is social infrastructure. And the first step that we have to make is to shift. And we can't dismantle the private ownership sector straight away, because that's too hard. But we can certainly start to, as you say, buy up existing housing, or start building as well, but buy up existing housing. And a couple of things just to to layer on top of what you've been talking about. Historic England did a study. Now it's UK-wide, but they have said that there are 680,000 homes that could be delivered by reusing existing historic buildings. Now, again, we've got a ludicrous situation where VAT is charged on reusing a building, and there is no VAT on a new build. And I won't go bore people, but I've heard all sorts of examples where someone is building a lift, for example, or replacing a lift, and if they put it on the outside of a building and call it new, it's 30,000. If they replace it in its existing formation, it's 80,000. I mean, it's completely bonkers. So that's an easy win. And on top of that, though, what the question I've got for you is, right to buy was brought in, under the Thatcher era with very good intentions, and I know lots of people have really benefited, and that's great. Should we stop right to buy? Because that seems ludicrous that we're building homes, social homes, or I think social homes are the wrong word, homes for people to access, and then we're selling them off so people can make a market rate. So do we end right to buy? And the second thing is, do we uncouple the delivery of social and affordable housing from the private developer? Should we just say, look, Mr. or Mrs., although there are very few Mrs. private developers, but Mr. Private Developer, you crack on and do your market stuff, but we will, as a government, deliver infrastructure housing, which is for all, and as you rightly say, it's not just about people on social, it's all young people, anybody who wants to be in London. I mean, sorry, just to one other thing. This morning I caught the tube at 6 a.m. and on the Northern Line, and the people who are coming in to service London are coming in from a long way, and that's just not right, just completely not right. So we've got to find a way to fix it.
I mean, just on your last point, you get this phenomenon in a kind of really extreme form in Oxford, which has got a green belt, which means people drive across the green belt to get into town, which obviously is not environmentally desirable, not good use of their time, and creates massive traffic problems in Oxford. But to go back to your first point, yes, absolutely. We're talking about social infrastructure. So it requires the same kind of attitudes that we get applied to other kinds of infrastructure, like transport, like energy, which is a publicly pushed, if not a publicly led endeavour. We shouldn't be looking to sort of like abolish private ownership. We shouldn't be looking to sort of take away, destroy the private housing market. Right to buy, an important motivation behind behind the right to buy was the belief that people like owning their own homes if they can, or most people do. And that's true, and that should be available. But we now have a situation where that's getting less and less available, and other options are also less and less attractive. What we should be talking about is a kind of rebalancing, not sort of bash home ownership on the head, but make other options as attractive and more accessible and more available. Having said that, yes, right to buy should be suspended in a situation where we have this housing need. That just seems to be a kind of luxury that
we can't
can't really be justified. Yeah, so does that answer all your points, or was there?
Yeah, I think so. And I think on the decoupling the delivery of affordable and social.
Yeah, and I also agree with that. So we've got into this situation sort of by accident, where this concept of planning gain has just turned into the main mechanism for providing affordable housing, such that we get into the situation we got into recently in London, which is when the private sector decides it's not a good time to build because of high building costs and stagnant sale prices, that the supply of affordable housing also dries up at the same time, with the result that Sadiq Khan has had to kind of lower the amount of affordable housing he's asking for from developers just to get anything built at all. And that seems like a flawed model to me. Much better is, as you say, you let Mr. or occasionally Mrs. House Builder build their houses. You tax them, because planning gain is essentially a form of taxation that is rather clumsily imposed. And you spend that money on affordable housing delivered separately from them.
I guess the next question is about funding a social or a government. I think we're going to have to find a different word from social, because you want people to feel, and I think about lots of young people who move to London and maybe they're here for, say, 5 to 8 years. You know, it's not where they're necessarily going to bring up their families, but it's where they find their careers and start off. They should be having a nice environment in that period, which is affordable. So, you know, I see social housing in the broadest possible point. But again, one of the questions we've asked at a couple of our housing events of our audience, which tends to be older, and there is an ongoing tension between people saying everyone who's old is a NIMBY and they're loaded because they've got all this cash in their houses, and if I'm young, you're stopping me from getting my foot on the ladder, and you're stopping planning and all those things. But actually, when you drill down, most of the people who do have cash, and we talk a lot about the UK having no money, but in private hands, there is enormous amounts of wealth in private, particularly those people who are 60 and over. So we ask a question: if there was a bond, you know, a housing infrastructure bond that had a very modest return, would you put some of your money into it if you were sort of incentivized to do so? And we've asked that, I think, Dave, at 3 or 4 of our events, and every time everyone puts their hand up and says yes. So there is money out there. I think we need to be more creative in terms of how we get it. And perhaps I'm a bit, being Australian, we're a little bit more happy clappy. And we're very, you know, we love a good jingle and a sense of patriotism, and it sort of seems to unleash the grey pound or grey dollar very quickly. How do we access, you know, so all of the people who've made money in the last 30 years out of property, how do we access their money in a way that they're willing to give it to us or give to the government?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is a generational issue. Because there is this older generation that includes me and probably Dave who've done very well. You know, we bought houses for sort of like 1/10 of what they're now worth, and we've never paid any tax on that uplift, except if we sell, we might have to pay some stamp duty. And yeah, but then the huge challenge is, how do you shift some of that wealth to the younger generation? And we're not even talking about people who've just arrived in London in their 20s, you know, trying to make their way. And I think at that age, you know, you can put up with a degree of, you know, discomfort in return for the sort of the rewards the city has to offer. But I think what a bigger problem is the next stage, when people do want to start families, you know, and they still can't get a decent home to live, whether in London or in surrounding parts of southern England. So I think, you know, what's going to happen eventually is the votes of people who have an interest in the status quo are going to be outweighed by the votes of people who suffer from it. And we're getting to that point. But we're not there yet. And I mean, I think it has to be, I mean, bonds, great. If you can incentivize the older holders of wealth to invest in that. I think it might have to be tax eventually. We'll have to come into it, which will be extremely difficult and unpopular. But there has to be a way of taxing property wealth.
Yeah. Well, the tax thing, I think that's, you know, just from it's such an emotive issue, isn't it? I mean, you just said something really, well, you know, we all know it, but you've done very well out of property, as have I. But there's something emotive about saying, well, come on, you've got to give it back. So I guess, you know, my view is perhaps governments could trial a bit of carrot, because stick is going to be a hard old...
Yeah, that's
political. These things are very, very difficult politically, aren't they? You know, taking away the right to buy might make perfect sense to all of us, but doing it, you know, you can see trouble and constant speculation about lots and lots of ideas about taxing housing better, and there's always going to be some votes to be lost from somewhere if you introduce those things. So it is really hard, isn't it? Could I, if you don't mind, just go on to a slightly different thing? As I know this is close to your heart, Leanne, so you should probably take the baton from me in a moment. But something else you talk about in your book, Rowan, is repurposing or converting abandoned buildings that were made originally as offices or for other kinds of work premises, and turning those, this is something you could do perhaps more quickly, turning those into dwellings. Now, it seems to me that is a good idea in theory, but in practice hasn't always worked out well. So what's the right way to go about that, do you think?
Okay. I mean, as we said earlier, there's a huge kind of environmental issue here. Someone worked out that if we build 300,000 homes a year, which is the rate the government is talking about, until 2050, that alone, the construction of that housing alone, will use up the country's entire carbon budget. So that means that we have to be creative, both in the way new houses are built and also the way we reuse existing fabric. The coalition government and then the Conservative government after that brought in changed rules on permitted development, which said that you can make offices into homes without planning permission, and then in some circumstances you can make retail into homes without planning permission. That unfortunately produced some of the worst housing that has been created, because simply it gave developers a charter to sort of bodge up the worst possible conversions. You literally had homes without windows, tiny floor plans, homes built in kind of office car parks that were completely, these places exist and still exist. If you do that, you just have to have some way of imposing standards. And I also think it needs a proactive role by government. You have to incentivize, help the processes of converting these places. In the same way that the development of the Docklands, for all its faults, was done. So, if you're talking about making a shopping centre into homes using existing fabric, that's a really challenging thing to do. The buildings are kind of the wrong shape. There are all sorts of doubts about how marketable it is. So you would have to treat, say, retail areas as like development zones, or something like sort of mini new towns. That's something that requires something like a development corporation to come in and, prime the pump and overcome the obstacles that make it hard to do. Or you can leave it to developers at a small scale, but you just have to have some quite basic rules about, what kind of homes you're making. I think this is not something for government, but it's something for sort of maybe creative developers, which is you change your mindset. So in the 70s and 80s in London and other cities, there was the phenomenon of the loft, of warehouse conversions. And people would come along and they discover these derelict ex-industrial buildings, which were not obviously the right shape for homes. They'd have low ceilings, deep plans, small windows sometimes, but they would make them into attractive places to live by exploiting the kind of generosity of the space. So you'd have a home that was not ideal in some important respects, but it simply had more floor area than or more volume than a conventional home. And so it's kind of a trade-off. So, I'm living in this weird, probably hard to heat space in a kind of dock in the undeveloped Docklands, but I can roam around, and it's not your typical rabbit hutch. What seems to be happening at the moment when people convert offices is they try and make your standard sort of 600 fair square foot unit in this awkward situation, and so you're kind of getting the worst of both worlds. It's small and it's awkward.
I I think that's a very interesting point, because with lofts, I think that people weren't trying to squeeze the volume of units into the lofts, whereas it's almost like we've taken a sort of new build model and said, let's try and squeeze it into an existing building, and that just doesn't work.
And this is being done in New York, where quite a lot of office blocks have been converted to residential. And yeah, they have these insane plans with rooms that they call sort of studies, which are just like boxes with no windows.
And that's actually, that takes us to an interesting point, because you talked earlier about too much space. But what is too little space? Because I saw something on social media the other day about, basically, it looked like, a small room that someone said, this is my kitchen, and you can it was uninhabitable as far as I'm concerned. But a lot of designers are pushing this as micro living as a solution, and it absolutely gives me the creeps to think that anybody is being sort of sold this idea as a way of living a human life.
Yeah, I mean, I have a problem with this whole idea of kind of micro living, of sort of ingenious design that enables you to live in smaller and smaller spaces. Partly because there's just a limit to that, human beings and furniture and things that don't shrink. But also because invariably whatever you might gain from that goes back to the landowner. So any saving you make on the cost of building a place, any kind of efficiency you get out of it is a benefit to the person who owns the land and builds the building and sells it, not to the ultimate buyer, because what determines what the ultimate buyer pays is what they can just about afford. So this idea of micro flats is very suspect. By the way, something I think that has been reasonably successful in London is the Housing Design Guide, that I think started under Ken Livingstone and was published under Boris Johnson, which sets basic standards of room sizes, orientation, double aspect, etc., outdoor space. And, house builders complain about it sometimes, but I like it because it means that standards are just baked into the process, which ultimately is reflected in land values. So, if a developer looks at a land and they know that they have to provide this quality of housing, they'll pay less for the site. Which seems to me like a sensible way to go.
Okay, all right. Well, look, I think perhaps we're on 42 minutes. This is the moment to basically agree that Rowan should be in charge of everything, and the sooner this is arranged, the better it will be for everyone. I've asked all my top line questions, as we journalists say. Unless you have other things you'd like to pursue, Leanne, I think I'd be quite happy to wrap it up there. So much food for thought, Rowan. It's been so interesting. Thank you. Leanne?
Yes. Yeah, Rowan, the only thing I'd ask is, will you help us put together a jingle for the infrastructure housing bond? Something soaring.
Wow, that's a challenge.
To inspire and loosen wallets.
I'll ask my wife, who plays the fiddle. She'd be better at it than me.
All right. So thank you very much again, Rowan, for joining us. And it's been great fun, very educational, lots to think about. And let's try and stay cheerful. And thank you, audience, for joining us on this latest edition of Talk About London. Good.
Thank you.
Okay.